It's not tenable to have 35% tariffs on an industry like this. It's not tenable to have 50% tariffs on critical sectors like steel, aluminum, or copper, says one trade official. These inputs eventually get paid for by American manufacturers and importers. The sentiment reflects growing frustration across North America as trade tensions reach new heights in August 2025. In Windsor, Canadian auto workers anxiously await the outcome of U.S. policy decisions. In New York City, a beloved family-owned toy store shutters its doors after more than 40 years. And in Washington, President Donald Trump shows no signs of pulling back on his escalating tariff strategy. Canada's response has been firm and strategic. Rather than retreating, the federal government is reinforcing its economic defenses, protecting vulnerable industries, supporting workers, and holding firm in trade negotiations that may shape the continent's economic future. Former Canadian Minister of International Trade Mary has called the 35% tariffs unsustainable. While they certainly hurt Canadian exporters, the true cost is borne by U.S. manufacturers, importers, and ultimately consumers. She emphasizes the deeply integrated nature of the North American supply chain, noting that over 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. remain tariff-free under USMCA, especially in key sectors like autos and energy. Her stance is that Canada must secure a good deal, not just any deal. In parallel, Ottawa is accelerating diversification efforts, strengthening trade partnerships through the CPTPP and new agreements with Europe and Asia to reduce economic reliance on the United States. This diversification, combined with continued USMCA-compliant trade, gives Canada real leverage at the negotiating table. The Ontario government, under Premier Doug Ford, has announced a $1 billion emergency loan fund to help businesses in steel, aluminum, and auto manufacturing sectors hit hardest by U.S. tariffs. The initiative, under the Protecting Ontario Fund, is designed to stabilize payrolls and prevent facility closures. Eligible businesses must have at least 10 employees, $2 million in annual revenue, and must have exhausted existing federal tariff support programs. Loans range from $250,000 to $40 million, repayable over 6 years. Ford is also pushing for tax cuts, GST relief, and lower interest rates to keep major automakers invested in the province. It's a proactive defense of Ontario's industrial backbone, with no expectation that the U.S. will soften its position anytime soon. On his 200th day in office, President Trump imposed new tariffs on dozens of countries. Although recent CBS News polls show most Americans still view the economy positively, many also expect rising prices in the near future. U.S. companies are adjusting in real time. One example, Westside Kids, a long-standing toy store in New York, closed permanently after struggling to absorb the costs of tariffs on Chinese imports. The store had sourced 90% of its products from China and was already battling online competitors. With margins crushed and customer spending down, the shop couldn't survive. This story reflects a broader challenge for small businesses across the U.S. Unlike large retailers with buying power and inventory space, small operations feel tariff impacts almost immediately. Many consumers pull back on spending as prices rise. According to Yale Budget Lab, American households could face an additional $200 to $800 per year in costs due to 2025 tariff measures, a burden that hits lower-income families hardest. This trade clash reveals two very different strategies. Trump's approach is one of economic pressure to extract concessions. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney and with provincial backing, is instead providing targeted domestic support, engaging diplomatically, and refusing to accept a deal that undermines long-term interests. The visible effects of these choices are playing out across the U.S., with closed shops, strained consumers, and shaken supply chains. What began as a trade dispute is now a test of economic endurance. Canada appears willing to absorb short-term pain for long-term positioning, while the U.S. administration is under pressure to prove that its aggressive approach will produce results before domestic backlash grows stronger. Trump has argued that Canada has long been difficult to deal with. He insists the U.S. doesn't need Canadian autos, lumber, or energy. Yet behind the bluster, even U.S. officials admit that Trump's own team is unclear on what his endgame looks like. While Canada faces a 35% tariff on non-USMCA goods, other nations have negotiated lower tariff ceilings in exchange for concessions. Switzerland, for example, faced a 39% hike after talks failed, while Mexico secured a 90-day delay. Beijing, meanwhile, is mounting its own countermeasures, blunting U.S. influence with supply chain strategies that go beyond traditional trade metrics. Canada remains a key energy supplier to the U.S., exporting nearly all of its oil southward. It's a sector not yet targeted by tariffs, likely because Washington understands the disruption it would cause to U.S. energy security. Under Carney's leadership, Canada has opted for patience and resilience. Instead of accepting rushed concessions, Ottawa is bolstering ties with Mexico, opening new export markets, and protecting core industries from sudden shocks. Canada's energy exports remain one of its most strategic assets, offering leverage Washington is unlikely to challenge without significant domestic blowback. This interdependence gives Canada time to maneuver. Trump's leverage over China appears even more limited. According to reports, Beijing has tightened its grip on critical minerals used in Western defense manufacturing. China dominates 60 to 70% of global rare earth mining and around 90% of refining. Since late 2024, export rules have tightened on minerals essential for weapons, jet engines, and advanced electronics, driving up costs for U.S. contractors. China has also made major gains in energy independence, processing sanctioned oil from countries like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela through smaller refiners and exporting finished products throughout Asia. By doing this, China lowers domestic energy costs, strengthens its refining capacity, and sidesteps the bite of U.S. sanctions. These strategic moves give China room to maneuver while denying the U.S. quick wins. Trump aims to make resistance to U.S. terms costlier than compliance, but both Canada and China are responding asymmetrically. Canada leans on its energy role, China restricts access to essential inputs. Neither is responding tit for tat. Instead, they are targeting U.S. vulnerabilities that tariffs cannot fix. The result is a landscape where the costs of economic confrontation are increasingly borne by Americans, from defense contractors to families buying school supplies. Trump wants quick, visible wins, trade deals that prove American strength. Carney's strategy is slower and steadier: preserve negotiating channels, guard Canada's structural advantages, and avoid unsustainable concessions. Xi Jinping's approach is even more long-term, reshaping industries to make future conflicts less harmful to China. What's unfolding is no longer about tariffs on paper but about which country can adapt and hold out the longest under pressure. Canada's energy leverage and diversification strategy, combined with China's dominance in critical materials, are forcing the U.S. to confront the limits of economic coercion. Among the latest rounds of tariffs, one Canadian industry that's drawn long-standing U.S. frustration is dairy. While dairy wasn't directly hit by Trump's 35% hike on non-USMCA goods in August, it remains a symbolic and practical flashpoint. Trump has consistently criticized Canada's dairy supply management system as a protectionist barrier. This system limits how much dairy Canadian farmers can produce and how much foreign product, including from the U.S., can enter the market. If those limits are exceeded, tariffs surge, up to 241% on milk and nearly 300% on butter, according to Canadian Border Services Agency data. The system has existed for over 6 decades, designed to stabilize prices and protect small farms. With U.S. megadairies housing tens of thousands of cows, Canada's regulations prevent them from flooding the market. American producers already export about $800 million worth of dairy products to Canada annually, while Canada sends around $300 million in return. But to Trump and many U.S. farmers, the high tariffs and capped quotas represent a lost opportunity. In response, Canada's Parliament recently passed legislation prohibiting any government from using supply management as a bargaining chip in future trade deals. The bill had strong cross-party support, reflecting past frustrations where promises to protect the system were quietly walked back during negotiations. Changing it now would require repealing the law and paying a heavy political price. The defense of supply management extends beyond Quebec. Dairy farmers in British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories view it as vital for rural stability. This rare political consensus gives Ottawa a united front. Prime Minister Carney and his trade officials know that dismantling the system even partially could allow foreign dairy to take up nearly 18% of the Canadian market, a level industry groups say would destabilize the entire system. Job losses, farm closures, and economic decline in rural areas could follow. But Canada isn't just defending dairy. Its real strength lies in broader leverage. The US depends on Canada for energy, critical minerals, and automotive inputs, vital sectors that are deeply entwined with American industry. This makes Canada's negotiating position stronger than it appears. Trump may have hoped that pressure would bring a swift deal. But instead, Canada's legal and political safeguards have slowed the process. The dairy sector remains intact, and Canada is signaling it would rather walk away than concede. Meanwhile, U.S. dairy producers continue to face oversupply, volatile pricing, and stiff global competition. Higher tariffs on other Canadian goods may satisfy domestic political goals, but they also risk doing more harm to American importers than they help U.S. farmers, a reminder that not every bluff works.